Welcome to Woodbury Writes Podcast. I'm your host, Sandy Carlson, and I'm here today with writer Jackson Kuhl. He is the author of the Gothic novellas, A Season of Whispers, and the forthcoming The Island of Small Misfortunes, as well as the Revolutionary War biography, Samuel Smedley, Connecticut Privateer. Kuhl's journalism and essays have appeared in Atlas Obscura, the Journal of the American Revolution, National Geographic News, and other publications. His short fiction has been published in Professor Charlatan Bardot's travel anthology, Black Static, Horror Library, Love Letters to Poe, Night Script, and numerous anthologies. He lives in coastal Connecticut, and you can visit him online at jacksonkuhl.com. That's Jackson, Kuhl.com. Welcome, Jackson. Thanks for joining me on Woodbury Writes.
Thank you for having me, Sandy.
Oh, it's exciting to explore the kinds of writing that you do and to get our listeners familiar with you as an author. So would you give us some background? What got you started as a writer?
I just, as a kid, I think it's a common story with a lot of writers. They write when they're kids. I did work in journalism for years. And I always sort of found myself leaning towards any kind of journalism that dealt with any kind of history or archaeology, or something where I had to sort of dig deep into the past. And I ended up doing some grad work in archaeology and started doing freelance journalism with any kind of a historical research angle. And I wrote for about 10 years. I wrote for some children's magazines about history and archaeology. I wrote a blog about dinosaurs for kids. And eventually that culminated in my first book, which was Samuel Smedley, Connecticut Privateer, which is a book about the Revolutionary War hero Samuel Smedley. He lived here in Fairfield, Connecticut, and during the Revolutionary War, Connecticut had its own state navy. And at the age of 23, he was the captain of the state navy's flagship, which was the ship Defense. And he had this sort of remarkable career where he went and they took a number of prizes where they were taking British ships, took over 15 prizes. He shipwrecked off of New London, then went and had a couple more privateering commissions, was actually captured and imprisoned in Plymouth, England. Escaped into France, met Ben Franklin. Franklin sent him up to Amsterdam, where he met John Adams. John Adams sent him back to Philadelphia with a couple of cargo ships that he had there. And I believe that Smedley was carrying the first correspondence from Adams to the Continental Congress in Philadelphia about that they had begun negotiating a peace with Britain. And after the war, he was the collector of customs here in Fairfield. So he had a remarkable story. And I did a tremendous amount of research for the book, including at the State Archives in Hartford. After that, I felt I was a little exhausted, felt a little constrained by nonfiction, especially regarding dialogue. And a lot of people get upset if you're writing history, if you start putting in dialogue. That you imagined or come up with. So, I felt like, well, let me write some historical fiction where I can actually sort of put the dialogue in that I want to put in, to get the point across that I want to get put across. And it was kind of a break from nonfiction. I was writing short fiction. So I was writing like historical short fiction, short stories. And then gradually, I began to put in these sort of Gothic elements that started creeping in. And it was because I love ghost stories. And I always, my favorite is just to get an anthology of ghost stories and just sit down. M.R. James, Robert Aikman, Poe, of course. I just love that. And so when I was writing, I was finding these elements were sort of creeping in. And it makes sense, right? Because Gothic is the past returning to intrude upon the present, right? That's what the genre is. So, of course, it plays perfectly into history. And then the next thing I knew, I was writing, my stories were getting longer, and I was writing these historical Gothic novellas. And so here I am. So I have one, A Season of Whispers, came out in 2020, and The Island of Small Misfortunes, which is my next one, is due to come out in 2025.
Excellent. I'm just, as a Connecticut native myself and somebody who's fascinated by our state's history, I'm just curious. I guess I'm wondering one thing, and that is, why did I not learn about Samuel Smedley when I was a school kid? I would have just been all over that story. Any thoughts on that?
It's an amazing story, and I actually was writing how I found about it. I was writing. I was doing some research for an article for one of those children's magazines, and I found this reference to him, and I was like, "What is this? Who is this guy? About this whole story." And the more I dug into it, the more. And you're right. I don't understand. This is like an amazing, amazing story. There is a fine line between piracy and privateers, and he was essentially a pirate working for the state of Connecticut. There were legal rules, and so he wasn't a pirate. He was, there were laws that he had to abide by, but he was going out and attacking British ships, taking the ships back in, and they were selling the cargoes into the ships, and it's absolutely amazing. I can't answer your question. One of the great things that I found, Connecticut has the nickname the provision state, and that was because that we were providing a lot of the food and the material to the Continental Army for their troops. And one of the ways we were providing was that we were going and capturing these British merchant ships and bringing their cargoes in, and those cargoes were ending up, feeding either directly or indirectly, because we were selling and using the proceeds. Ended up feeding and caring for both the Continental Army and the Continental Navy. So it was absolutely fascinating. I can't answer your question why, but I do think the story should be better known.
Yeah, I'm just curious, in your research and the fact that you're from coastal Connecticut, are there any historical markers or any landmarks people can go see that recognize Smedley and his contribution to our revolution?
Beyond his gravestone, which is here in Fairfield, you can come see that. The only other thing, nothing directly. I mean, the defense wrecked off the mouth of the river there in New London. I'd be very curious to see. I know the couple of years ago, I knew that the Coast Guard was doing a survey of all the shipwrecks in Long Island Sound, and I would love to get my hands on some of those surveys to see if they found the wreck down there. Beyond that, no, there's nothing really for you to see regarding Smedley beyond his gravestone. The only other thing I can think of in Black Rock, of course, which is a neighborhood in Bridgeport, that was Fairfield's original seaport, and that's where Smedley was sailing out of. You can see if you go there. There's a place called St. Mary's by the Sea, which is this walkway along the water there at the mouth of the harbor. And if you go at low tide, you can actually see where there was a fort. Fairfield was burned during the Revolutionary War, and the reason why the British did not burn Black Rock Harbor was that there was a fort at the mouth, and they couldn't get past our cannon fire. And if you go there, like I said, at low tide, you'll see there's like a plaque with an explanation with it, that you can see the rectangle of the fort. Beyond that, no, but it is an absolutely fascinating history.
Well, that it is amazing, and I want to get into talking about your Gothic writing, but I'm just wondering about Samuel Smedley. What has been your audience response to that book? Has it made its way into any classrooms or?
Yeah, I would be happy. I'm sure my publisher would be happy to issue a class version, a class edition textbook. No, I've gotten a lot of good response from locals who love the history and love finding out this kind of stuff about Connecticut, about Fairfield. I think it goes beyond Fairfield, because he was working for the state. So I think anybody who loves Connecticut history would love the book. So yeah, I've had a lot of great reaction. When the book came out, I was driving all over the state, giving talks at historical societies and libraries, and I had a couple of chapters of the Daughters of the American Revolution had me, and I talked at I gave a presentation up at the River Museum up in Essex. So it's been a great reaction.
Yeah, and I see the line you're drawing from our revolutionary history into Gothic writing, and it makes me think of something a literature professor said to me way back a long time ago, or said to the class, that the electric light changed everything for literature, and all the mystery kind of went out the window, and our historical past and the wonderment we can have about that, and those people living in that time, not sure what was beyond the forest or what was beyond the river.
Right.
It lends itself to that. And you mentioned going from writing short stories to novellas, which is such an interesting length. Could you talk about what about the novella form works for you and what you write?
So I think it goes back to my dad. He had this bookcase down our basement when I was growing up, and he had built this bookcase so it was on wheels, it was on casters. So it was this big bookcase, but you could turn it because it was on wheels. So imagine this big bookcase, both sides just packed with hundreds of paperbacks. He had all these paperbacks from the 1950s, 60s, 1970s, and he loved science fiction. And so just imagine, Alfred Bester, Robert Heinlein, Philip K. Dick, Frank Herbert, all these, these sort of classic science fiction authors. And so, you had no excuse to be bored in my household growing up, because if it was bored, you go down and just look on the bookcase, pluck a book off. And if you didn't like what was on one side, you just flipped it around. And a lot of these books I grew up reading were shorter books. And, I didn't really think of it at the time. I just found that it was sort of like a very satisfying length. And then, like, when I became a professional writer, I began sort of researching and realizing that a lot of these books were very short. They were not, a lot of these sort of pulpy, they were not long, 80,000 word door stoppers. They were very short, usually around 40 or 50,000 words, if that. Many of the books that we grow up or taught in high school are novellas. Like The Old Man and the Sea is under 27,000 words. Christmas Carol of Mice and Men, they're like 29,000 words. Animal Farm is 30,000. These are short books, and I just find that like very, very satisfying. When I was in grad school, I had a professor who it was a physics class, actually, and he said, and the only thing, there was homework, but the only grade in the class was the final. The final was a 10-page paper. That was it. And he said, if you can't say it in 10 pages, it's not worth saying. And I love that. And I did write, and I did write the 10-page paper, and I got an A in the class. And I sort of made that, I think, a guiding principle. Like, just, give me 40,000 words, which is a novella, about that length, and I'll tell you a good story.
That's great. And that could conceivably be an evening, a sitting, which would play into Poe's idea of having a unified effect from start to finish, and not put the bookmark in and come back and be horrified some more later, but have the full emotional experience of what the story's doing in the one sitting.
Exactly, right. So you're not breaking it up, because then, if you have that tension, if you have that feeling, that atmosphere that you're getting, but then you got to break it and go to work or something, like, well, that breaks it up, right? So you want to have that. It helps to keep that feeling consistent throughout the reading experience. Yeah, I agree.
Sure. When you go back after you've drafted and you revised, do you find that keeping it within the parameters of a novella send you back to sentence structure and word choice, that kind of thing, just to stay within the parameters of a novella?
Right. I mean, again, you got to keep it tight, right? You got to, you can't have anything superfluous. You got to, you've got to keep it, is this character saying, what I want to characterize that person, that personality, what purpose is this scene, providing, how is it driving the plot, and so on and so forth, because you don't have space to lose.
I would imagine with the kind of research that you do for your novellas, you probably have a lot of material that informs your story, but doesn't make it in, so to speak. Could you talk about your research process for A Season of Whispers?
So I read a lot of Herman Melville and Nathaniel Hawthorne. The book is set in the 19th century. It's set in a fictional transcendentalist utopian commune. So if you know anything about the transcendentalists, like in the 1830s, 1840s, there were at least two transcendentalist utopias up in Massachusetts. One was Brook Farm, and then the other one was Fruitlands. Both of them failed. Brook Farm did all right. It lasted a couple of years. Fruitlands was their philosophy was a radical veganism, and it failed almost immediately. It's very hard to grow food in the winter, right? So it collapsed almost immediately. And so I read, Hawthorne had stayed at Brook Farm. He was actually one of the earlier members. And he wrote a novel called The Blithedale Romance, which was a fictionalized account of his time at Brook Farm. And I read them to sort of capture the cadence and the manner of their writing, which is very heavy and sort of metaphor laden. And then, of course, Louisa May Alcott's Transcendental Wild Oats, which was her father was one of the co-founders of Fruitlands. And it's this I highly recommend it. It's basically the length of a short story. It's the satirical descent of just the sort of ridiculousness of her father and the other guy who founded it, Charles Vane. And it's very funny. I highly recommend it. And I also relied heavily on Ralph Waldo Emerson's Nature essay, which was the sort of one of the foundational documents of transcendentalism, and Henry David Thoreau's Walking and Walden for sort of understanding their mindset. I visited Brook Farm. There's not much there now that's from the time. And I sort of, but it was nice to just walk around and see the space where they were. And then I sort of married these ideas to an idea I had about, I had this sort of separate idea about the sort of lurking subterranean evil. And that was kind of based on this idea of, so in the book, people sort of disappear, but nobody really notices when they disappear. And so it was the question I had of, does anybody notice when people disappear if you just sort of vanish out of somebody's life? And it was only after I'd written this book, I realized that when it was about an experience from my childhood, which is I had grown up, the house I had grown up in New Jersey, was less than 400 yards from the nation's #1 Superfund site.
Oh boy.
I always say, you've probably heard of Love Canal. I say Love Canal was #2. Love Canal was for amateurs. We were playing on the expert level.
Boy.
#1, it was called something called the Lepari landfill. And what happened was there had been a number of companies in Philadelphia that had made all these chemicals, and they were bringing them over to New Jersey and dumping these chemicals. They had started in the 1950s, and I think they finally closed in 1971. And so I'm talking like hard chemicals: benzene, dichloroethylene, arsenic, lead, mercury. But the problem with South Jersey is that the soil is very sandy, and so it immediately began leaching into the groundwater. So there was like low birth weights, all these problems. And so I read figures, but I have the figures here, and I'm like, I still can't get over these figures. It was leaking 100,000 gallons a day of tainted groundwater. And they put a wall around it in 1983, and it was still leaking 2,500 gallons a day. They cleaned it up in the 90s, and so they say that it's all good now. But but this was this sort of like shadow in over the town for like my entire childhood. This because it had all kinds of effects, not just the physical effects, but of course in the real estate. It was a depressed town. And even now I kind of wonder, I have a family history of cancer. And I wondered, is that because that's how our family is, or do we have a family history of cancer from the landfill?
Right.
And so it's sort of like, I realized like after I wrote this book that about the sort of ambiguity of the disappearances, it's also the ambiguity of, what's happening to, my family and some of our neighbors. Do you really know what's killing you? And so I realized I've written this Gothic novella about a very real modern problem, which is, environmental pollution.
That's fascinating. And I gotta tell you, when I was growing up, I was a big fan of Louisa May Alcott. I read everything she wrote. My grandmother gave me a set of first editions. It was 2 volumes, and everything Joe wrote as a journalist was in there. When I became old enough to go to the downstairs part of the Danbury Public Library, where I grew up, I got the shelf. I read the Alcott shelf, and it was biography, including her Gothic fiction,
yes,
which she wrote after the Civil War because she had been damaged by mercury. They treated her with mercury for her illness, and she became, she would have these sort of fantastical dreams, and it influenced some of her shorter fiction. So she had the woman who wrote Little Women also wrote Gothic fiction.
So I actually did not know that about the mercury. That's fascinating. I'll have to look more into that. That's incredible. But yeah, a lot of people don't realize that she wrote, the same woman who wrote Little Women wrote all these sort of Gothic short stories, stories about mummies and like all this sort of very Poe-esque fiction, which I just love. I think it's just fascinating. It just goes to show you that, you shouldn't box in a writer, let her, you consider the full breadth of a writer's career.
That's right. And when you think this is a little off topic, but a woman of letters who knew how to market her product to feed her family. She was also a responsible leader of her family who knew the business of writing, and was running with the big dogs back then.
Which goes back to Fruitlands, right? Because and I know that's one of the themes of Little Women too. But it goes back to Fruitlands. Was that her father was a sort of like emotional wreck after Fruitlands collapsed, and it was basically her mother who just sort of grabbed the reins and was like, okay, and actually, like he literally would not get out of bed, and she was like, okay, I have to find somewhere for my family. They made arrangements with a neighbor that they could go stay at the neighbors, and basically came and like literally picked up a Bronson outfit and took them to the neighbor's house. And it was very much like the women had to take control because the men were just complete failures.
It is a great story, and it's just such a fascinating part of New England history, and also these utopian ideals, this sort of response to the Industrial Revolution and the evils that those were visiting in the world, that the attempt to address that through utopianism and those kinds of those dreamy things that don't really take into account human nature, and I suppose our ability to forget about each other, right, and lapse into a morose state of despair like Bronson, and forget why we're here.
Yeah, and I agree. And I don't think, I think they probably get a bad name. I think that Brook Farm was it was successful for several years. They just sort of made several very bad financial decisions at the end. They had come under the I guess spell of Charles Fourier, who was a French utopian philosopher. He had very specific ideas about how people should live, and that specifically they should live in a building that he laid out all this architecture in this building called a phalanstery, and this was basically like a college dorm with a green in the middle. And the idea was to kind of get people to living closely, and then sharing this a sort of community building. And at Brook Farm, they decided, okay, we're going to build one of these phalansteries. And they had put all their money into building this. And right before it was finished, it caught fire and burned to the ground, and it wiped them out financially. But before that, they were surviving. They were trying to grow their own food and be self-sufficient. And they succeeded a little bit doing that. But the big money maker was that they were running a school for local children. They were actually successful at that. So, not all utopias have to crash and burn, and I think they had some good ideas. They had some bad ideas too.
Did any of that kind of architecture figure into your novel?
I think I make a joke about it, but no, it's because, like I said, that was at the very tail end of Brook Farm. But I do not really, but I do describe that it was, that it's a communal farm. And that the ideals of the farm are a little bit more, one of the issues with Brook Farm, and this is what one of Hawthorne's complaints was, that, you have a lot of people who want to reform society and have ideas about how to live, but it's very hard to get them all on the same page, right? And so that certainly does come into play, where you have a bunch of people who are sort of butting heads about what form should this utopia take.
Right. Jackson, do you have your book with you? Would you mind reading a passage so we could just kind of hear your book's voice?
I have it right here. Yeah, you know what? I'll read the opening. There is an indescribable sense of satisfaction known only to a few in committing a murder and escaping its punishment. We nod in thankfulness as the newspaper tells us about the arrest of some strangler or alleyway knife man. We mutter to ourselves that justice has been served when we learn how the malefactor was marched up to the platform or thrown into a penitentiary cell. This is easier than the alternative, which is to consider in the recesses of our imaginations the number of villains who have not been arrested, who have not been executed or imprisoned. We assure ourselves they are fictitious, or at least number a small minority, simply because we assume a criminal can be identified by marks and tells. Yet nobody is truly familiar with his neighbor, nor can he account for every minute in a beloved spouse's day. And while we suppose we know the life stories of our fathers and grandfathers, we can place no reliance in what transpired during the years before we departed our mothers. No, it is better to recognize that outlaws whirl around us in the streets and parlors. By definition, the murder is perfect because everyone adjacent to the killer is blind and deaf to it.
Thank you. I'm just thinking of so many of the headlines I've been reading over the past week. There's so much of what you're saying is transports me into the text and reminds me of the world I'm living in and speaks to the relevance of story. Help us make sense of the world. So, Jackson, what is your next book about? Where are you headed now as a writer?
The forthcoming book, The Island of Small Misfortunes, that one is set in 1898. And it's about he's sort of a down on his luck sailor, the protagonist, and he thinks that he's jinxed, that he's been cursed somehow. And because of the Civil War, he's been estranged from his mother's side of the family, and so he sort of reunites with them on their private island off the coast of Connecticut. And I actually set it on a made-up island in the Thimble Islands, right off Branford. I love the Thimble Islands. I have a paddleboard, and I love to take a paddleboard out there. It's just so beautiful. I admire all the houses and be happy that I don't have to pay the flood insurance or for them. But so yeah, it's set on a fictional Thimble Island, and he gets embroiled. He finds out that his cousin committed suicide, or did he? And he also finds out that the island is haunted. So it's very much another Gothic. And then I'm currently writing a third one right now, which is set in the early 1930s. And it's I love the film Key Largo.
Oh, yeah.
And I've always imagined this was just, it's this funny idea, you always see in gangster films or films where there's criminals, they commit some kind of heist and they go to a hideout. And I always wondered, what if they went to the hideout and there was somebody already there? So that's the basis of that story.
Excellent. And will this next book that you're working on, will that take you back to the State Library in Hartford for research?
No, I think I could find everything I want to in my immediate vicinity, but I am thinking about going and doing another nonfiction. I think that maybe that will take me back to Hartford.
Excellent. I've heard great things about the reference librarians in Hartford from other Connecticut writers.
It is amazing the resources they have. It's one of these things you go in, you start poking around. It's amazing what they have. I mean, I was literally, Jonathan Trumbull was our original governor, right? And to have right before you the folios of like in his handwriting, the original letters, it's like over 200 years old. It's just amazing. Like I cannot believe this is I'm reading this right now. So it is amazing what they have, the resources they have.
That's great. I wish you the best of luck, and I'll be looking forward to seeing that title. Thank you for your time today, Jackson. It was a pleasure talking with you about your work.
Thank you so much, Sandy.